Good afternoon, good morning, or good noon, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us for today's event. This is a special event. I'm really excited about it. It's our very first Panelcast. This is a new series of events we'll be launching in 2019, and this is our very first one. We're joined by great panelists who I'll introduce shortly, but the topic for today's event is the enterprise IT landscape in 2019. And we're going to be talking about what to expect in the coming year and years from enterprise IT and how that could impact people. We're joined by Platform 9, Nutanix, Cohesity, and Scale Computing, and you see lots of faces right now. I'll be introducing them in just a second. But I want to talk about what this event is. This is a moderated discussion panel, and that's the intent. It's a thought leadership type event where we're going to talk about some of the issues of the day. We'll be answering your questions throughout the event. A number of you provided some really great questions on the registration form when you registered for this event. In fact, all the questions that are in the deck that we're going to be talking about today are ones that you provided, and we thank you for that. And we're joined by some really great industry experts and leaders. And most importantly, if you have another question that you have about what's coming in 2019, please ask it using the questions pane in the GoToWebinar control panel. If we have time, we'll be asking questions from the live audience today as well. Joining us on today's panel is four exemplary individuals, starting with Suresh Raghuram, who is the CEO and co-founder of Platform 9. Thank you, Suresh, for joining us today.
Very excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
We also have Teresa Miller, who is a principal technologist for Cohesity. Teresa, thank you as well for being here.
Thank you for having me. Looking forward to today.
And we have Mike Wronski, who is no stranger to the ActualTech Media audience. He is a senior product marketing manager from Nutanix. Mike, you're joining us from Vegas today. Thank you again.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Looking forward to this. It's going to be fun.
And we have Jeff Reedy, who is the CEO and co-founder of Scale Computing. Jeff, thank you for joining us from Indianapolis today.
Always a pleasure.
At the end of the event, we'll be giving away 3 Amazon gift cards, $100 each. So we'll pull people randomly from the audience for that. If this time of year, instead, if you prefer to donate your winnings to charity, these are some selected charities that we have. We're happy to make a donation in your name in lieu of a gift card. And lots of people actually select this option, so that's always gratifying to see. If you'd like to talk about this on social media, the hashtag is Panelcast. You can follow ActualTech Media at actualtechmedia.com. I'm sorry, just ActualTech Media. Or you can follow me, Scott Lowe. I'm going to briefly go through some notes that I wanted to sort of level set the playing field with before we get started with our panel. And this is basically a way to sort of set the stage, and I'm going to keep it brief because I really want to get to the questions that we have from our audience today. As I look at 2019, we're going to see, this is clear. The pace of change is not going to slow down. One of the things that's been stunning to me over the past 25 years of my career is exactly how fast things are now. When I started in IT in 1994, things were slower, much slower. It didn't seem like it at the time, but it's just incredible today how fast things change. That's not going to change. Digital transformation projects will unfortunately continue to fail. And it's mostly because people are just not ready and they don't understand it. And they still don't understand it, even as it gets talked about all the time. You know, one of the things we want to see from our enterprise IT vendor partners is how can we make these digital transformation projects more successful? If you look at various stats, 70 to 90% of these figures, of these values, of these projects, fail. That's not good. We'll probably see that trend continue a bit while people wrap their hands around what digital transformation really means. And if it's not already, security will become job one in almost every organization across the globe. And all you have to do is look at Marriott this week, right? 500 million records compromised, passport numbers, really bad stuff out there in the world. And we're seeing a movement towards security being a C-level, a true C-level enterprise. And we're actually seeing some people saying that IT should report to a CISO. I don't know if I agree with that, but it demonstrates that security is going to continue to be top of mind, and it should be, and it's a boardroom issue, will become a boardroom issue for even more organizations. As we look at people's career paths, and as I look at the future, I think that we see on the CIO path sort of a pendulum. You know, back in the day, a CIO was the super technologist, right? He was the guy who, or the gal that knew everything about the technology. In recent years, spurred by digital transformation efforts, there's been a swing to the other side, where the CIO in many organizations is a pure business person with some understanding of technology. I think that the CIO role will continue to become more hybrid, just like our organizations over time, with a mix of a good understanding of technology with a solid understanding of the business. And we want that. And we see that with a lot of people, but I think that's going to be the norm, a little bit more of a tilt towards the business side over time. On the IT staff front, this sounds like it's an oxymoron, that IT pros are more siloed yet more generalized than ever. I still see a lot of need for people to do specific jobs like manage storage and things like that. But I see it becoming more generalized as we subsume the infrastructure into cloud type scenarios. And so I think IT pros are going to have to learn to be more general while they continue to focus on their subject matter of expertise. But they're going to have to also become generalists to understand how it all fits together, even more than they do today. And as we look at the technology front, we're going to cloud, edge computing, containers, security, data protection. These are all things that are going to continue to be top of mind in 2019. Cloud, we're going to see a continued move to hybrid and public cloud with a need to have overarching fabrics that span the two. Edge computing is exploding, partially spurred by things like Internet of Things, remote office, branch office type environments. And even, I was looking at an edge use case recently where it's an in-car, use case. These edge data centers are increasingly important. Obviously, containers are the next wave of innovation. We see a lot of developers embracing containers as they look at new ways to build software, build solutions. These microservices-based architectures thrive in a container environment. And containers are just exploding and running everywhere, in the cloud, on the edge, in the data center, and everywhere else. I mean, even, if you look at, your iPhone, it's a container-based system that makes Siri work and things like that. I talked about security, and data protection goes hand in hand. And again, I'm going quickly because I want to get to the questions. These are things that we're not going to see a lack of focus on in 2019, especially if we look at data protection as a market. That is absolutely not just being evolved, but revolutionized with some of the newer vendors that are in this space today. And as I look at 2019 plus, I see some pretty key things happening. APIs are going to rule the world. That's and it's already starting to happen. And that helps with automation, orchestration, things like that. We obviously see a lot of AI-based things happening around automation and orchestration, but a lot of that's leveraged by leveraged by APIs. Managed services will become more important than they already are, even as organizations realize that they need more expertise than they have around digital transformation. A lot of organizations simply don't have the internal expertise to make some of these things happen, and they're going to need help. As far as cloud goes, I really do see hybrid cloud, and I think most people see hybrid cloud as the future. But there's got to be some kind of an overlay fabric that brings it all together, and we're seeing a lot of those pop up. That's going to become more and more important over time. And business processes will shift to be far more customer-centric as people undertake more digital transformation efforts. This has to happen. It is happening. It's not always happening successfully. Although I kind of like it when I order a Domino's pizza and it has the little thing on my phone that tells me when to expect my pizza. I don't like Domino's that much, but my son does. I was gone last week and he was ordering Domino's, telling me, I love that I can see the little truck. And that's awesome. So things like that, even that don't necessarily change how you make a pizza, it really, it revolutionizes the customer experience to make it a lot more enjoyable. And that's important. People want good experiences. Once again, this is our panel for today, and we're going to jump right into some questions. Are you guys ready?
Absolutely.
Let's do it.
Yep.
All right. So let's start with this question. Development is becoming increasingly important to organizations. The speed at which innovation is expected is driving the need for containers, serverless technologies, and the like. What does this mean for how organizations view the role for IT? Suresh, why don't you start with this one?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because there's no doubt that a lot of new applications are going to be written using containers, cloud-native technologies. Where possible, people are even skipping containers and going towards serverless patterns altogether. But IT now has to figure out how can they expose services like container platforms, container orchestration platforms, serverless experiences while continuing to support traditional applications, which probably run in VMs for some time to come, and that these platforms need to be supported in a hybrid context, right? It needs to be cloud independent, not be locked into any one cloud. So IT essentially owns the responsibility of supporting the platform. Some organizations try to build it themselves, but they essentially, the time to value with which they can, the speed with which they can expose these capabilities to their development organizations is going to be a key criteria for IT to be successful in enabling this.
Mike, I mean, this kind of thing is something that Nutanix is working on a lot as well. What are your thoughts on this idea that how is IT going to change as we look at containers and things like that?
And I definitely agree with what Suresh started off with. And what's interesting, I think, about this is we always, and as a technologist, and I think everyone on this call probably has that technology first background. And sometimes we forget the business process side of this, and there's a lot of adaptation the business has to go through to even allow IT to help manage these two distinct groups, right? Their IT in the past has been primarily about uptime and application delivery, and sometimes that goes in the face of the speed at which that we want to allow our developers to react and do these things. So that when you talk about what does it mean for how organizations view is how do we merge the role that IT has traditionally played with this new function of being essentially a service provider, and then balancing that with our on-prem services and our off-prem services. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot of interesting things go on, both in technology changes from respective companies or from business process.
Jeff or Teresa, do you have additional thoughts?
Sure. So I completely agree with both Mike and Suresh on what they said. The piece that I think is key here is how IT can then integrate with the business, but all of the processes that have to occur to make this happen. So, and it's not an easy thing. We talked about how IT is, it's leaner and we're becoming more generalists, yet there's still these specialized areas that people need to support. So it's going to be tricky. It is going to change things, but people are going to have to communicate more to make sure everything is functioning successfully in the end.
Jeff, it looked like you had some thoughts as well.
I was just going to boil it down to flexibility, right? I mean, the organization is going to expect IT to be much more flexible than they traditionally have been, and to be able to spin things up a lot faster than they have been. All the old stuff of IT still holds true. The applications need to work, they need to be fast, et cetera. But if there's one thing I'm hearing out there, it's that IT needs to be much more flexible.
One of the things this brings up to me is that we have this paradigm where we have to support the old and the new, and it's going to be that way for the foreseeable future. There's going to be a period of transition, just like there was from the mainframe to the mini, to the micro, and then on to this whole distributed paradigm that we're under now. How long do you think that's going to take? Is this a decades-long transition, or is it decades long, but it's got a long tail where we see a huge up ramp at the beginning, at some point, and then the stragglers come, 20 years later? Suresh, what are your thoughts on this need to support both, traditional?
Yeah, it's a great question, Scott. So I was an engineer at VMware for 12 years before we started the company 5 years ago, Platform 9. And so I was actually the engineer that built VMware's tools to migrate from physical machines to virtual machines. Unfortunately, so the idea then was you could just point to a physical machine and flip it into a VM. It kind of sort of worked just the same. We had to do some voodoo behind the scenes, but the apps didn't really have to change. The challenge that I see is containers involves touching apps. So if you have application developers available and you're able to squeeze in refactoring apps into competing business priorities such as feature delivery, new customer experiences that you're trying to build, that the development teams are trying to also do, then you could try to migrate. But our experience has been, at Platform 9, we support both a VM-based solution using OpenStack and a container-based solution using Kubernetes. Our experience has been that there's many large enterprises tend to have a lot of applications that are going to take a very long time to migrate. What ends up happening is that new applications tend to be written using containers and serverless, and some portion of existing apps can be refactored. It depends on the specifics of applications and how many, the availability of development resources. So I don't think it's going to be like the transition from physical machines to virtual machines, where a period of 3 years, most of the physical estate, I think, actually migrated onto the virtual estate. So I think it's going to be a much longer term transition, but a lot of new apps are going to be written. So the workload, as a percentage of workloads out there, containers and Kubernetes in particular is going to be driving a pretty significant percentage of workloads in the years to come.
One of the ways I've likened, I agree with you wholeheartedly on the challenges we have moving to a container-based world. One of the ways I've likened it is, the trucks you see on the road that have 14 cars on them? Well, we were driving, cars before, right? Now, with these trucks, you just put a whole bunch of cars on the same truck and drag them around. Now, it's not a great analogy, but it's, that's kind of like moving to a virtual environment. The cars look the same. Those are the applications. But we have a whole new paradigm that we're working under when it comes to, we're making a new car. Which is a lot different. It's almost like moving to a self-driving car, which is going to be a long, hassle, long road because there's so much that has to change. But yeah, I completely agree that that we're looking at a very different type of migration.
If I could just share one thought, Scott. One of the things that customers often come to us and ask us is there a way by which you can migrate our virtual machines into containers? And people are looking for a silver bullet, like the VMware Converter tool that I wrote all those years ago. And I would just caution, the nature of the problem is very different. There's some point solutions that have tried to do that, but in general, it's a complex problem, and don't expect a silver bullet to solve that. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon.
I agree.
We've seen that happen with cloud, right? People were doing lift and shift in the cloud, just expecting I could take my on-prem application, move it out to a public cloud scenario, didn't understand the broader implications. And you're seeing similar attempts to containerize existing applications. And there's going to be many that have to fail first to figure out that that's not the proper way to do it. And there's a lot more upfront work into deciding what to do containerized and what not to, and just look for net new development.
You're right. It doesn't affect everyone either. Not every enterprise will even care about containers. So, that goes back to what Suresh said too. It's going to take a long time. I think it's kind of shown that it's here to stay, but at the same time, not everyone's going to adopt it. So it is going to take that time.
Let's move on to our next question. And Jeff, I'm going to ask you to answer this one. Edge computing appears to be the next big area for growth. How do you think it's going to play a role in enterprise architecture in 2019?
Well, I think I'll just start off by giving one of what could be many definitions of what the edge is, and I'm stealing this from another vendor who's not on the panel, but their definition, which I'll run with here, is edge is any IT system that exists outside the four walls of the data center, and so you have all the same challenges, right? You need the high availability, you need the flexibility, you need to be able to manage these things. But they're existing somewhere else, and ultimately, typically on premises near wherever data and such is being collected. That brings a whole bunch of challenges, not least of which is the fact that you probably don't have a lot of IT staff out there at these edge locations. And what we're seeing are that customers that may have maybe they have 5-10 folks in their IT infrastructure group centrally, that we're managing maybe a couple of data centers and a cloud service. Now that same group is going to manage that and perhaps 1,000 edge locations if they're a retailer, for example. They're not adding new people, and so they need to be thinking about, how am I going to manage all these edge locations? There's plenty of needs. I mean, ultimately, when we talk about flexibility, it's all about running the applications in the way that the application makes sense and where the application makes sense. Like choosing between a VM and a container, or bare metal for that matter, it really depends on the application. Choosing where the application is going to run, whether it's at the edge in a data center in the cloud, really depends on the application.
Mike, your thoughts on this?
Sure. And so from an architecture perspective, to kind of build on what Jeff was talking about, the infrastructure needs to be a little bit more bulletproof, I think. When you don't have skilled IT in the field and you have thousands of retail locations, you really want that to be as simple as possible for a non-skilled worker to do something as basic as reset, power on, power off. And then outside of that, you're talking about architecturally, how do we do things that we would normally do easily in the data center? What's the replacement for ILO? How do I get into back office traffic if I lose my data connections? There's a lot of operational considerations for edge computing at scale that many probably haven't thought of. Older way of doing this is they dropped you dropped some data connection from the internet, or just did a WAN connection out to some site, threw in a couple servers and hope for the best. But that doesn't scale. And so the real thing is here is, how do we operationalize that and scale it? That the 1 store, 2 stores is easy, but if you're a giant retailer with 1,000 stores, you can't be rolling a truck. You can't be putting someone on a plane every time some basic process has to happen, or worry about babysitting a software upgrade because it's flaky. So all of that process of recovery, back out of software upgrades in advance will lead into how we scale out with this edge computing.
Teresa, do you have thoughts on edge?
Yeah, so I think one of the key values to bring up here too is, what the goal with edge is to bring whatever application it is you're trying to deliver closer to the endpoint. So one of the areas that you see this even talked about is Internet of Things. In terms of everything we're doing in the cloud, it's almost like and I don't want to call it safe, because nothing's ever safe, right? It's when everyone's going to be hacked at some point, it seems. But from a security perspective, there's value in keeping that stuff at the edge as well, and not bringing it back to the data center.
Suresh, what are your thoughts on how edge computing can impact IT architecture?
I think Jeff and Mike made some really good points that I agree with. I think complexity at the edge and the simplicity is really important. Operational costs could rise very significantly if we don't address those. One thing that I'd like to add on top of that is, again, going back to digital transformation, I think organizations need to be thinking about how do they expose the edge computing with the same kind of cloud services that they're able to get in their core data centers or in the public cloud. So from a software delivery point of view, you need to be able to developers need to be able to push new experiences, new capabilities to the edge just as easily via code, via programmatic interfaces as they can anywhere else, right? To some extent, that's one of the reasons I think there's a lot of interest in the hybrid cloud approach, is because people want a way to give developers the freedom to be able to innovate without getting locked into the specifics of edge locations versus data center locations versus public cloud locations. So the edge needs to be programmable. It needs to be something you can push code into very rapidly, and therefore deliver new experiences to your customers at new speeds.
Very good. So, Mike, I'm going to start with you on this one because for obvious reasons. So hyperconvergence has become a thing. I don't know if you guys were aware of this. Probably Jeff and Mike, you might have heard it. So I guess the question is, hyperconvergence is, if you look at the last few years, the term has been muddied, I guess is a way to put it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that we're looking at, it's an evolution of the technology. But what's next? Is it extensions that turn HCI into something broader, like we see with like what NetApp is doing and Datrium is doing, and in some ways? Is it a whole new architecture altogether? Is it making it a broader, like what a broader platform, like what you're doing with Nutanix? Is it something like Scale's doing, which is bringing it to the masses and tying together edge locations with the data center with the cloud? Mike, why don't you start, and then Jeff, if you can pick up from there, that'd be great.
Sure. So I think what we just talked about, the edge, is a good segue, and that's why what Suresh was talking about is uniforming the experience across is really how our view of what HCI becomes. It might be an overused term. We start talking about everything being software defined, API driven. It really needs to be all services. So today, the base definition for HCI is really about removing a complex storage tier, bringing the storage in close, and converging those tiers together. We add virtualization to that. We add containers and possibly serverless. That's more what's in the box from a software, and that's the base level primitives that I would say that drive all these things. But ideally, it's I need to run an application, and I need the way to make that programmable and put that everywhere. So HCI, I think, is going to be the next gen of that, and what we call it, that you never know what's going to be the catch buzzwords in that space. But the true version of software defined everything in the full stack, where everything is programmable, and we've completely abstracted out the hardware itself. We won't be discussing the hardware as much. It really is about delivering those services across all the different sides. It's a complete software play, the full stack. and the tighter the integration across that. So it's, from the bottom or from the top, both operationally as well as programmability for the applications, is where we see it going.
And Jeff, Scale's taken a pretty interesting approach to hyperconvergence with what you've done with open source KVM and adding services on top of that. What are your thoughts on where we're headed with hyperconvergence?
Well, I mean, I think Mike is clearly, correct, which is it really comes down to software-defined everything. I mean, at the end of the day, hyperconvergence is a technology which is part of a broader technology stack. It's software-defined storage in its own way. As you start to move to everything to be software-defined, that opens up the opportunity to do a lot more orchestration and automation. At the end of the day, your early point about IT becoming sort of less, hardcore technologists and more business focused, also puts IT in the mindset of thinking more like a business user. And a business user really doesn't give a hoot what technologies are being used where and why, right? They just want the applications to work and to be fast and reliable. And IT starting to think that way too. So, when you look at HCI and these other software-defined technologies all coming together, that opens up automation, orchestration, the ability for machine intelligence to play a role in augmenting what that IT staff can do.
And Teresa, Cohesity's taken a pretty interesting approach with their flavor of a hyperconverged secondary storage architecture. But you've also started to go beyond that as well. What do you see as a next phase of hyperconvergence in the world?
Yeah, well, I agree with both of them. I think the software-defined angle is huge because your IT person is going to have to be able to pick up and do many things. I think one of the challenges that's still faced by the enterprise, though, is cycles in terms of how long they keep equipment. So, hyperconvergence is amazing, but not everyone has the budget to put it in today. So, but the great thing is that we're getting the word out about these things so that when they're ready to turn over their budget cycles, they're now understanding the value of hyperconvergence and can easily move forward with that, which helps their leaner IT staffs.
Suresh, do you have thoughts on hyperconvergence?
Yeah, I think my link is a little flaky, by the way, but I can hear you very well. So I think one unsolved problem that I see customers still looking for solutions on is hyperconvergence has enabled new levels of simplicity and a new experience that customers are able to get across different types of resources, compute, storage, and network. But customers still have all these silos. They have the public cloud, they have on-prem environments, they have legacy environments, they have new hyperconverged architectures. How do they manage across these different environments? How do they simplify the experience to end users within the organization and to IT operations across this complex mesh? I think that's one of the unsolved problems that I think we'll see progress on in 2019.
I would agree. We don't want to build new silos as we move to these new technologies. How do we collapse them? And that's where a more of a programmable abstraction becomes the way. So it's not a vendor-specific silo that we're building or a public cloud-specific silo. It's an abstraction that lets the businesses choose the best of any public cloud. There's going to be something that Microsoft offering has. It might be better than what Google or Amazon offers, and you want to make sure that you're not building out an Amazon silo and an Azure silo, for example. And what's that abstraction layer across the top? So when we talk about software programmability, that's definitely how I see that being a way to solve that problem. Is we need to make sure that we're appropriately abstracting with either standards-based or the right APIs and infrastructure, software infrastructure behind it to do that.
In fact, we've got a question on that integration and abstraction we'll be discussing shortly. Speaking of abstraction, as we look at how we abstract infrastructure, and I think software-defined and virtualization are two, although virtualization really is sort of software-defined servers, right? As we look at this continuation of what we've been doing, and we move away from standard racks of stacks of data centers, which areas of virtualization overall do you see poised to grow the most and the fastest? Teresa, what are your thoughts on this?
So having done a lot in the virtualization space over the years, one of the trends that I'm seeing is actually with the workstations, getting them out to the cloud for business continuity purposes, and making sure that there's a seamless experience, a similar workflow for the users across the board. So that is definitely one of them that I'm seeing.
Suresh?
I think it's an interesting question. I actually think that virtualization has hit, it's been so successful as a technology that I think it's pretty much, I think, attained a large portion of the serviceable market. So I think, and that's something we should celebrate, by the way. It's been an incredible success. I actually think that containerization is where most of the growth is going to be. It's got a relatively small portion of the market. I mean, if you leave out the West Coast, the echo chamber that I live in the Bay Area, it's got a long way to go. So I think that that's the area that's going to be growing fastest, absolutely in percentage terms. And I think it's going to be that way for 5 to 10 years now.
Let me, if I can jump in for a second, I want to build on what Teresa just said. And for me, I see, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, Suresh, that probably containers is going to be one of the fastest growing areas. I think one of the areas that there's a lot of untapped potential still around the desktop, to Teresa's point. That end user devices and things like that, especially as we get more prolific with how many devices we have, we're going to want that singular experience. So areas like desktop as a service, like we're seeing from Microsoft and with Nutanix's Frame.io acquisition. And Jeff, does Scout still have a relationship with WorkSpot?
We do, yeah, and other as well. Yeah.
With things like that, I see those as areas that are primed for growth and virtualization as organizations. Number one, I think it's a security issue too. The more points of presence you have of data, the more you have to secure. But if you're looking at things like desktop as a service, which is a virtualized desktop, of course, you can present the screen without having to present the data, and it's easier to secure. So I see that as personally one area that could be huge for growth. Mike and Jeff, do you have additional thoughts on this?
I was thinking also along the lines of networking hasn't really taken the same leaps. And we have a lot of networking technologies, but
Yeah.
I'm really not seeing any one thing take off. We still have quite a bit of complexity in on-prem environments. We talk about edge and IoT. I think there's a lot of areas for networking to be improved there as we increase the number of devices, the number of endpoints, manageability. The idea of being able to abstract more of that side and making the network more programmable. We have a lot of vendors, a lot of competing solutions now, but I think it's still pretty hard for a lot of enterprises to understand. They're still struggling with basic leaf spine, top of rack switch architectures, which may not be the way you need to do things as we move forward. It's just some of those things are going to hit a scale limit with the type of things we're doing now. So more in the areas of virtualizing and making the network more software defined is something I think we're going to see more of in the next couple of years.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think all that's true. I'll also just comment that as you move further away from the data center, I mean, I certainly am amazed at how little virtualization sometimes exists as you get into what we're now calling edge locations. We're now deploying mission critical applications there, and they have a couple of bare metal servers that are 10 years old. And so it's, there's a lot to be done. I think to one of the earlier points, this will be a long tail. I think there will be a big wave of containerization, but there'll be a long tail of applications that make their way there very, very slowly. When I started Scale, I didn't expect that I would have customers running OS2 on hyperconvergence, but I do, right? And if they haven't taken the time yet to migrate OS2 to something else, they're probably not jumping at containers real quick. So.
And that's an interesting point. I didn't think anybody ran OS2 anymore, but that's not.
IT never
in
dies.
production, I'll add.
I'm sure we still see a lot of netware out there from time to time too. Okay, so this is one we can't ignore. We have to talk about security. It seems like they're in the news every day, and as we look at the proliferation of clouds in this multi-cloud world, is there a way for an enterprise to ensure a standard security architecture that can span the private and public cloud? This was actually something that came from an audience member that it's a great question. I mean, Jeff, do you have thoughts on something like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a real tricky problem, right? Because when you really dig into a lot of these security breaches, a huge portion of them are the result of human error, as opposed to IT really dropping the ball. And so that's a very difficult problem. As we start to have more distributed computing and more edge, you compound this problem because now you're talking about deployments that are small enough that somebody could literally like grab the server and walk off with it. And so you've got a whole physical security problem. When you think about, you could be running Intel NUCs as servers, right? Somebody could just steal it. And then what happens? Obviously, the encryption, the management, being able to have that, that data. On one hand, the flexibility to move that data in and out of the cloud, local edge, et cetera. But then, you've got to really, at the end of the day, you've got to figure out the ways to, to control the users who have access to this stuff.
To your point about human error, which is absolutely 100% agree with you, do you think some of the emerging technologies that we see around artificial intelligence and machine learning based security products have the potential to not necessarily fully address it, but to allow us to mitigate potential breaches faster?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot to be said there. I mean, you can think of it almost as sort of a, the next version of an intrusion detection system, right? You're sort of detecting, weird behavior from a user inside the network. But again, it's easier for the bad guys to outsmart, the lazy user that isn't really tech savvy than it is to come up with more ways to stop them.
So, Teresa, do you think there's an overarching security model that will emerge that can support both public and private cloud equally and consistently?
No, that's the short answer.
I probably disagree with Teresa. I think that this is one of the reasons why there is a lot of interest in technologies like containers. And it's not a solved problem by any stretch of means, but I think that there are going to be, so philosophically, I think the problem is that security has been too often an afterthought, right?
Yeah.
For a long time now, security has been, if you think about it fundamentally, going back to what Jeff said, I don't think the users, the developers aren't lazy, they're distracted. They have a zillion priorities. Security is one of them, and security tends to come at the tail end, and there's a separate security organization. So organizationally, I think security needs to be brought further up into the design and development process, and I think containers help you do that. Now, I think that for reasons we already discussed, containers only helps you with new applications or applications you're able to remodel. What about your existing applications? Going back to the specific question from the audience, I think as long as enterprises are managing different public clouds differently and private clouds differently and virtualization farms differently, then I think that there's not going to be a consistent way to do basic things like who has access to what quotas of capacity in what resource environments, what is the access control that they have, how do they program to a common programming model or a common deployment model. And those are very basic gaps that as long as you have these silos, I think, you can't do unified microsegmentation, you can't do control access to development users or DevOps users. And I think it'll continue to be a major issue. And this is, I think, one of the reasons organizations need to look at a hybrid cloud architecture to better provide primitives for the end user organization to not fall into obvious traps.
If I could chain some things together we already had talked about, Scott, real quickly. We talked a lot about how software defined is everything. We want API driven. Automation, I think, is going to drive an extension of what Suresh was talking about. How do we remove the human component for a lot of these things? When it's a verified process, it's automated, the chance of human error is less. In order to get there, though, we actually have to remove all these places that we're stuck with manual processes today because of some of these silos. So as we get to more API-driven, programmable data centers, now the security component gets to be somewhere where we can tie that in from, just like Suresh mentioned, all the way through the entire stack, all the way through the development process. That these are all something that I can have a known methodology for automating how to lock things down, how to set up my role-based access control. And similarly for the adaption side, after something's been detected, what are all those processes? If it's a manual process when something bad has been detected, again, it's a problem. It needs to be, these steps need to be automated.
Yeah, I just want to add one real quick. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Well, I wanted to add to my no. I had a little bit more to expand on with that. The reason I say no here is the hybrid cloud. You cannot control what each enterprise has internally, and they're likely connecting their enterprise infrastructure up to the cloud from a networking perspective. We can't control how often they're updating their Cisco networking, for example. And I think that that's going to leave security gaps no matter what, because so much of it falls on the IT that is running things locally at the enterprise. Now, that being said, from the cloud side, what enterprises can do is definitely take their guidance seriously when they're implementing hybrid cloud. For example, there's a lot of really great processes that can be followed to secure that. And so that's where I was going with my no. Now, I think all of the great technology advancements that have been mentioned, I think the containers, I think those are all really great things, but they're something that might have to be waited for. But they're up and coming for sure.
All right. Let's talk about something that's not necessarily technology centric. The economy plays a huge role in what we're going to do, right? We've really enjoyed a decade-long, maybe not quite a decade, but rally that's propelled startup fortunes, really. Enabled enterprise customers to make a lot of new investments with low interest rates and all that good stuff that we just didn't see before. Do you think that changes in 2019 as we see continued market volatility? And what do you think the outcomes look like? Teresa, do you have any thoughts on this?
I do. I think.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I'll let Teresa go first, please.
Oh, okay. Well, I think this is very interesting. I actually at one point did work in the financial industry. And so, but that being said, when it comes to market volatility, it does always affect underlying budgets and what people are willing to spend their money on going forward. Will it be severe? I'm not sure. I mean, hopefully businesses have been making great decisions with the money they've been earning in this long rally we've had for the last 10 years. In the end, is it going to slow development or growth? No. So I'm optimistic that things will continue to move forward. Maybe just not as fast a pace.
Suresh?
I think one of the interesting things has been if you look at the cloud market as a whole, the price points have actually escalated quite significantly. If you think about it, VMware is at about $8 billion in revenue today. But the public cloud revenue across just the three big players is nearly $50 billion run rate. And so I think one of the things that has happened is that people have been prioritizing the speed and efficiency that they can deliver to the business ahead of the cost and cost economics and ROI. And in an up economy where your priority is winning market share and getting new capabilities out into the market, I think that's been the right call. If and when we do get into a slowdown or even a recession, I think that you might see a change in how people behave in terms of being more cost conscious and having more hard dollar conversations. I mean, we saw this in 2008 and 9, and I think you could expect that there'll be a much more heightened awareness on ROI than maybe just sheer time to market in the last 5 years.
Jeff, what are your thoughts on this?
Oh, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that what happens if, in fact, there's this volatility that's proposed here, which we, of course, don't know. Otherwise, we'd all be, stock market masters and wouldn't have to be sitting here on this, right? But, what'll happen is it's a shift in priorities, right? It is the, it turns out the cloud is more expensive, so maybe I don't do that yet, right? But, there's other technologies which are all about saving money, right? And so you'll just see the innovation and the focus of those dollars shift a bit, but people still need IT, right? That's not going away regardless of what the overall economy does.
Mike?
Yeah, I was also going to add that, what is starting to become apparent is that IT is, I believe, noticing these different changes and trying to prepare for it. So we're starting to see tooling and tool sets, applications that are providing much better visibility into ROI and TCO at an application level, so that you can start to making intelligent decisions about this. And that's what was missing in the past, is that, you know, you've all heard the adage about the surprise cloud bill or whatever. And that's just because people were, you know, just like you mentioned, they were enjoying the benefits of the user experience without really looking at the cost consciousness. So now there's an entire area in the development of applications and software that's giving this very specific tooling that can enable true brokerage of these facilities. So does it make sense to run where? What does it actually cost me over the long run? And allowing IT, as you mentioned earlier, in that CIO swing of business versus technologist, making a business-based decision on where to put applications and when to spend my time and money on. So we're going to definitely see a lot more tooling there.
We just got a question from the audience that builds on this. So I want to ask it. And Suresh, I'll send this to you to start. Do the tariff threats that we're seeing today, do you think that they are going to have an impact on the enterprise IT market in a significant way? And if you don't,
I think it's not just I think it is, but I think it may be in multiple ways. I think it's increasing. We're probably living in a time of increasing geopolitical tensions. I personally had the opportunity to work with potential customers in China, and I can see the effect that the macro environment is having in those conversations. We are an American startup, and we're perceived in a very different way than maybe we would have been a few years ago. Going back to the tariff threat, I think one of the most obvious ways in which that's impacting is we've seen the stock market maybe fall 15%. The NASDAQ has probably fallen 15% from its highs. And anytime that happens, 20% is considered to be a bar for a slowdown or a recession. It affects the overall macro environment and how aggressive CEOs and boardrooms are in terms of investments. And what their priorities are, going back to Mike's comment on shifting priorities. So I think that, I do think it has an effect in terms of geopolitical environments and in terms of boardroom priorities that are being set by the macro.
That's a really good point.
Now, I'd like to add that I hate to even think, the terrorism part is definitely a thought, but I would challenge that, much like security has been an afterthought and a bolt-on, general business continuity disaster recovery in many enterprises is similarly felt that way. So whether or not it's a terrorist event, a natural disaster, or just a large power outage, I would gather that as many enterprises are not well equipped to handle the most basic and non-terror driven type of event that would have an availability event for them. These new technologies, though, that we were talking about, whether that's HCI, containerization, there's another opportunity again here to design architectures with business continuity in mind from the beginning, as opposed to it being a bolt-on afterthought.
So another one that we sort of alluded to earlier, and this idea of an API-driven world, I think, is partially the answer here, but is interchangeability and integration between product manufacturers increasing or decreasing? Jeff?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly increasing, right? I mean, this is the whole API thing, right? And being able to, you publish APIs, and then people can start interacting with those APIs and come up with new products, a new way of using those products. But I'll just comment. I mean, it's far from a smooth path, right? I mean, people come up with new technologies. It might be some time before there's APIs. There's competing technologies. Which ones are people interoperating with? I mean, there's lots of different things, but I think in general, the overall trend is certainly API driven. And that's something, if I'm in IT, right, being familiar with how I'm going to take somebody's APIs and use them in another product, et cetera, is really, it would be top of mind for me.
Mike?
Well, I absolutely agree on some of this, but what I also see is we may be just squeezing the balloon sometimes. The great things about standards is, there's so many of them to choose from. So what we'll have to see is, what are the unifying things? Certain parts of the larger public cloud vendors have driven some ideas of standardization and APIs. But if the APIs aren't standardized, I think we're going to have a similar level of lack of interchangeability. But I definitely see a desire by our customers, the enterprise, to have this, and they're the ones that are going to push us as software and solution vendors into this, because the big bad word of lock-in. Customers are aware of this. They don't always want to get trapped. Now, obviously, cost value plays into that role, but if we have to do this at the API level, that means it needs to be more standards-based, because one vendor's API is drastically different in delivery and capabilities from another vendor's API. I think we have a similar problem.
Teresa, what are your thoughts on integration and interchangeability between systems?
Yeah, I think it varies, to be honest. I think in some cases, I mean, I think the intention is there for it to be increasing and for these platforms to be able to talk with each other through their APIs. But I also, to what Mike said, think that without the standardization, it can be very challenging at times for enterprise to pull kind of into one standard central platform. The other area that I see challenges with is cloud to cloud. Going back to IT a little bit as a business, and I guess the multi-cloud thing is where I'm going with that. One part of the business might have just spun up Azure, and then your developers, not talking to everybody else, might have brought online AWS. And I don't know that there's a really great way to bring those all together so everybody can be happy and use the platforms that they need from a business perspective. So that's it.
Trish, what are your thoughts on this as far as it looks in the future? I mean, one of the questions that just came in was, over the next 3 years, are we moving faster than expected from API to artificial intelligence doing the API work? But the base of the question is, will APIs really rule the world?
I think that they are. I think if you think about it, step back and think about it, compared to 10 years ago or even 15 years ago, if you step back and look at the macro, there's no doubt that we're much more API driven today. Going back to the point that you're making, Scott, this question on whether interchangeability and integration is increasing. One example, I'm with Jeff. I think that it is increasing. And one example of that is containers and Kubernetes. You know how, going back to the problem that Teresa was also talking about, Amazon used to have their own proprietary services. Historically, they've led the way in terms of launching new services. And they used to have a proprietary service called Elastic Container Service, ECS. But in the case of the community of developers and IT operations people, DevOps people who are working on containers and Docker and Kubernetes, created so much gravity around this open community and standard that they forced even the world's largest technology vendor, I think today, is Amazon. It forced even them to standardize and offer a Kubernetes service. And now Azure is also doing the same. So I think this is just one example. I'm sure it varies in different areas. I don't quite see that in the security space as much. But I think if you step back and look at it, in the last 10 to 15 years, we're getting much more API driven. And I think open source in particular is going to drive a lot of integration and standardization.
All right, let's talk about cloud again. So from this viewer, they see that cloud can ultimately exceed on-premises. And we've seen a lot of studies that say the same thing, right, over time, for general workloads beyond small systems. Do you think there's a point at which, if you look at cloud from a total cost, I mean, maybe if you look at it from a direct cost versus a total cost of ownership, it's different. But Teresa, what are your thoughts on cloud costs? And are we looking at a future where cloud ultimately really is cheaper than on-premises, or is it going to be more about the outcomes versus the cost?
Well, I think as we've seen today, right, it's been more about the outcomes versus the costs. It is expensive. There is a bit of shift that I think needs to be considered, though, from a budgetary perspective. You're no longer managing many of the updates or the infrastructure on-prem. So even though it may look like it costs more, there is, I don't know that all organizations counted the human power that went into maintaining those systems when they're getting that sticker shock. So that's one thing. Long term, I think costs, I think it's still yet to be seen whether or not that could go down. I think like any product, when commodity, the more people that buy it, oftentimes that does drive the cost down. But I don't see everybody jumping into the cloud for everything at this point. So I think we just need to watch and wait.
Suresh, you have thoughts on this?
So I think that it really varies based on workloads. Going back to the last 5-7 years or so, I think businesses have been prioritizing opportunity cost. So there's the operational cost of cloud, but then you think about the opportunity cost of getting new capabilities to customers and transforming the business with digital transformation. That's what people have been prioritizing. So I don't think it's been that businesses have been foolhardy in spending more money on the cloud. They're taking into account both the operational cost, but the savings in terms of the opportunity cost in going after that. But as digital transformation matures and as the macroeconomic cycle turns, or when it does turn, I do think that there will be a renewed focus on the operating costs. And I think there's very little debate that, generally speaking, operating costs on the cloud are higher than, can easily exceed the on-premises costs. So I think it'll be tied to the macro. I think it'll be tied to individual organizations feeling that they've gotten to the point where they've transformed the business with digital technologies and they've realized those opportunity costs, and now they want to go back and refocus on fine-tuning and refining the operational costs.
Mike?
So kind of adding on that, what we're not talking about here is if we don't change what we're doing now, we go back, just use the general definition of insanity. I think the cloud will continue to be less, maybe less costly. If it's traditional architectures, traditional 3-tier, but as customers start doing a true on-prem refactoring of how they build out and architect their data centers, that's where that parity or a true competitive cost nature is going to come from. So it is a two-part thing. You do have to change what you're doing and currently in your data center to make sure that part becomes competitive to the certain workloads that will make sense to be on-prem versus the ones that are going to make sense to be in the cloud.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think that, when you really look at it, the cloud is more expensive, and it's more expensive as provided by companies who are subsidizing the cost, right? It's Amazon, it's Google, it's Microsoft. We're all making money in other ways. So I think that we're a ways away from seeing the cloud actually become cheaper, and working against that happening is what Mike just said, right? The on-prem stuff is becoming easier to use, cheaper, and more efficient. So then that seems, in my world, at least, to be happening faster than seeing the price of the cloud come down.
Okay. We're getting close to the end of our event. We'll probably have one more question. So, as we look at what IT needs to do, it needs to meet all the needs of the business, but the business isn't always interested in continually buying more stuff, tools, software, platforms, hardware, things like that. How does the business forge ahead without IT just continue to buy stuff? Suresh, do you want to take this one?
I think it's a great question. I think 15 years ago, Scott, we used to have a term called server consolidation, for those of you who are old enough to know it. I think there's absolutely a bit of a sprawl today across on-premises technologies, legacy on-premises technologies, new technologies like our friends Mike and Jeff are bringing to the market, and Teresa. And I think I think we're ready for, and then there's the public clouds, right? AWS, Azure, Google, they all have this stuff. And the tool sprawl and the operational sprawl that is arising from this broad mishmash is pretty incredible. So I think one of the best things that could happen for IT to simplify and improve efficiency and simplify their operational experience is we need cloud consolidation. I think this is where hybrid cloud comes in, is by consolidating across these different environments with a true single unified experience for operations and dev. I think they can simplify and forge ahead.
Jeff?
Yeah, I think the thing to remember is the number one cost in IT are human beings, right? It's easy to think of IT as going out and buying more products and more software, but at the end of the day, what the company's spending money on are people, and demonstrating that you can be more efficient with fewer people, even if it does require buying some of those software and tools, is really how you justify those purchases, right? If I'm in IT, the alternative to making that next purchase of the next gen technology might be hiring 3 more people, which I'm guessing the CFO would think differently about making that capital purchase.
Teresa.
Yeah, so the best case scenario that I've seen here is when your CIO is fully integrated with the business and working together with them. The outcomes in the end aren't IT just forcing technology at the business that they're never going to use because they didn't want it to begin with. The outcome is that the business is getting what they need to do the work they need to do.
And Mike, for the last word.
Yep, no, perfect. Teresa I think she nailed it on the head with the business outcomes. So in order to really think about not just buying stuff, is to start with, what do I change first? We know you're going to have to change something. You know you're going to be buying something. You know, if you're going to the cloud, you're still buying. Your checks are getting written. So how do they make those decisions based on business outcome? Where do I start first as part of that transformation, as opposed to what was the most convenient thing to work on, or the really cool tech that someone came and talked to me about? So that's what we're going to start seeing, is a reshifting of the IT group to really focus on what's the business need, how do we solve this, and not repeat the sins of the past.
Thank you all to our panel. We're out of time. Thank you to our panel for this great discussion. This was really fantastic. Teresa, Mike, Jeff, and Suresh, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hey, thank you.
As our final act in our first panel cast, we're going to give away $300 Amazon gift cards, and we'll be sending an email to you after the event. If you'd like to donate the winnings to charity instead, please just let us know. We send you that email. Our winners are David Aldridge, Jeff Kirby, and Steph Thimonier. I'm probably butchering the name. And if you're a vendor on today's event and you are interested in participating in ActualTech Media events, please just email sales@actualtechmedia.com and we'll get right back to you. To our audience, thank you for joining us. To our panelists, thank you for your wisdom and your advice. And everyone have a great holiday season. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy holidays.